Welcome everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Gary Morrison. I am the Roman historian here at Canterbury. But tonight I'm going to be, or late this afternoon, I'm going to be talking a little bit on a tangential topic, looking at World War I. I'm coming from a classicist's perspective, so looking at classical antiquity really within a diary and some of the imagery around World War I as we'll come to see. So that's the sort of focus and area that we'll be looking at today. So I just want to emphasise at the start, I'm not a World War I historian, and my perspective therefore is probably a little bit different. We'll see how it goes. On board the troopship Tahiti, and a part of the first contingent of New Zealand soldiers departing for World War I, was a Scottish-born New Zealander by the name of Hugh Stewart. In 1914, Stewart had only recently arrived in Christchurch. It was 2 years earlier that he had taken up an academic position as Professor of Classics at the then Canterbury College. So he walked these very quads and halls around us here at the Arts Centre. When war broke out, he was among the first to enlist, and he was given the rank of second lieutenant. He was to prove to be a formidable soldier and leader, recognised by both the French and British with awards for gallantry, as you can see from the slide behind me. He moved quickly through the ranks, promoted to colonel at the end of the war when he was appointed to lead the education unit set up to help soldiers transition back into civilian life. He saw action at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. Those here may know him as the author of the second volume of New Zealand's unofficial or popular history of the war, the New Zealand Division 1916 to 19, a popular history based on official records. Stewart survived the war, returning to his adopted country and position at Canterbury College. He remained in New Zealand until 1926, when his career took him back to the UK. He never fully broke his link with New Zealand, returning to visit, and it was in 1934, when travelling back to England from one such visit, that he unexpectedly died at sea. He was 50 years old. I've chosen to introduce my paper with this biographical account because Hugh Stewart will feature extensively in what I have to say. However, I also want to emphasise that this is not a talk about Stewart's career and service. Rather, he brings to light a part of the New Zealand Anzac narrative that until now has received little attention. Hugh Stewart, more directly than most, connects antiquity and New Zealand's World War I narrative. It is this connection and the formative role that the Greco-Roman world plays in what we remember and how we remember the war, rather than an account of Hugh Stewart's career, that I hope to demonstrate today. Let us begin then not with Stewart's diaries, but with some general observations selected to demonstrate the importance of the imagery of the ancient world in 19th and 20th century Western society. In short, the education system of the time embraced what we term and know of as classics. Anyone with an education would know the myths and histories, the Greeks and Romans. Many would know Greek and Latin, a point demonstrated by an entry in the World War I diary of one James McFurter, a rugged Southland farmer. In 1914, when he was in Egypt, he visited the Cairo Archaeological Museum, and after viewing a few Greek inscriptions, simply notes in his diary, "This is why we did ancient Greek in school." Without doubt, the classical world was a part of the social fabric of colonial New Zealand. Moreover, heroism and war, imperialism and duty were where classical allusions excelled. This is not the place to definitively demonstrate all of the links, but I will present one example that may be of interest. We've all here, I hope, or who has heard of Thermopylae? Right. Perhaps you might have even seen the recent bad movie. Or better, you may have read Herodotus' account. In short, 480 BCE, Xerxes, the Persian king, had invaded Greece with a massive army. An allied Greek force under the command of Leonidas, the Spartan king, chose Thermopylae as a defensive line. In the end, Xerxes found a way around the defensive position, and Leonidas sent most of the Greek forces away so that they could fight another day. He remained with 300 Spartans and a few other Greeks that he forced to stay, and they heroically defended the position, although ultimately, of course, the Persians prevailed. The heroic imagery exhibited by the Spartans is recognised and directly compared with more recent conflicts, such as the charge of the Light Brigade, or, in a New Zealand context, the deed and daring found in the New Zealand Wars. In a recent study, Matthew Trundle demonstrates how a small group of Māori holding out against numerically superior British forces at Otakau in April 1864 was compared to the Spartans at Thermopylae. On the 50th anniversary of the siege, the connection is reinforced by the Whanganui Chronicle, which ran a story under the headline, A Modern Thermopylae. Meanwhile, the Evening Post used the headline, Historic Otakau, the Memory of Heroes. And in the article itself, it used Thermopylae to emphasise the heroism and sacrifice of the Māori defenders. The glorification of heroic endeavour when tragic loss is a part of the narrative was where classical allusions excelled. To that end, it may surprise that Thermopylae did not gain more traction in accounting for Anzac endeavours at Gallipoli. But geography dictated that Homer would dominate this story. The headline for the press on the 1st of May 1915, reporting the landings at Anzac Cove, is demonstrative. It read, Operations on the Plain of Troy. A bit of literary licence is clearly in play here with regards to exact locations. What is clear is that Homer is drawn into the 20th century narrative. It is perhaps the New Zealand author Maurice Shadbolt that sums it up best in the introduction to his work, Voices of Gallipoli, where he writes, and I quote, The Gallipoli Peninsula, as 600 historians have been at pains to remind us, rises dully across the water from Homer's Troy. Shadbolt himself is not immune from Homer's reach, quickly following up his comment with a suggestion that the soldiers who fought on the plains of Troy would not have sung Homeric verses. Rather, those that survived might have remembered their war, and I quote, as aged and often still angry warriors do in these pages. But then, according to the old lie, heroes were not destined to grow old. Achilles, for one, explicitly chooses everlasting glory over a long life. This is a message that resonated through the centuries, so that the early 20th century definition of heroism in the Western tradition is born from ancient conflicts and heroic endeavour. Undoubtedly, imperial duty follows a similar trajectory. The British used the classical tradition to promote a cultural unity between European, Western, educated colonists, and to promote a select view of the world where citizenship, political and military responsibility were key pillars in society. In the same way, a sense of duty was fostered. Like the Athenians and the Romans, the British established imperial obligations, not least military support, built on the imagery of the past. Here, imperial duty and heroic endeavour combined to create an image of warfare and duty defined by Homer. It was mythical and idealised. An Anzac Day story run by the Timaru Herald in 1917 demonstrates this very point. The report goes as far as to compare the Trojan War and the deeds of Anzac soldiers, suggesting the most recent feats are greater. In extolling the New Zealand soldiers' heroic actions, the same article concludes that these men are also, and I quote, the builders and preservers of an empire. Heroic endeavour and imperialism are developed through the powerful imagery of Homer. I suggest that there is another purpose at play with this type of imagery that we must mention even if we cannot explore it in detail now. Homer's heroic descriptions were a way to distort the truth and control the narrative. Applying a classical lens to the destructive battles at Gallipoli and on the Western Front created distance, at least in the official version of events. For the wider New Zealand population, this became a way to contextualise the horrific destruction by adding an overlay of glory. The impression one gets looking back is that the imagery provided a degree of sanitation. It hid the reality. To demonstrate these very points, one need only think of Horace's line, Dulce et decorum est, per patria more. To So you've got the actual part of the end part of Owen's poem there on the left-hand side for you. Translated, it is sweet and glorious to die for one's country. Horace was, in the early 20th century, understood to have supported Augustus's imperial agenda, and so more broadly he helped inspire imperialism and nationalistic duty across the British Empire, including New Zealand. Horace's quoted line, promoting heroic endeavour for one's country, was embraced by many. In 1913, it had even been inscribed into the wall of the chapel at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Of course, not all accepted the official line and imperialistic interpretation. It is no accident the soldier poet Wilfred Owen chose DULCE et DECORUM est as the title of what now must be his most well-known poem, and that he utilised the full line in the stinging attack on war and the ultimate sacrifice. Owen famously labels Horace's call as the old lie. Whether it was to promote heroic imagery or provide the material to question the reality men faced, the ancient world was fundamental. Before we move on, I should perhaps also note that Horace's line could have an echo in a significant New Zealand war memorial as well, through a Latin inscription probably penned by Stewart, who we met at the start of this talk, a point to which we'll return at the end. For now, let us accept the overview I've presented and return to Stewart to look briefly at some of the entries in his diary which I think are revealing. We'll focus mainly on the Gallipoli campaign, simply because the geographic location is rich with classical history. As we have noted, Homer's Troy is the most obvious example, but the region offers more, especially for a generation that was raised on classical texts. It is here that Leander swam the straits to see Hero, Jason and the Argonauts ventured this way in search of the Golden Fleece, while at times the Athenians, Spartans, Persians and Alexander, among others, secured control of the region. This history is on Stewart's mind as he waits on Lemnos a week before landing in what was to become Anzac Cove. On the evening of the 17th of April, he attends a lecture, which was given by Mr. A. Herbert, that played on the Great Adventure theme, a talk that suggested the forthcoming campaign would be the greatest turning point in world history. Considering the strategic importance of the Dardanelles throughout history and the names or peoples I've just mentioned, this is no small claim. Stewart thought so too. The hollowness of it perhaps evidenced by his closing remark in that day's diary entry. Trojan expedition, not however mentioned. If nothing else, Stewart here demonstrates the long shadow of antiquity. His reflection on the situation, the location and the events unfolding around him is not however complete. The following day, April 18th, we're reminded that he has ancient texts with him. He has been reading Virgil and Horace Odes 3 as it happens. On this occasion, direct mention is made to Aeneid 8, from which we can speculate about battle preparation, themes and anxiety, and these are key topics within this part of the Aeneid. Of course, Virgil's work is also closely aligned with Augustus's regime and imperialism, so it can be considered appropriate reading material in light of the points already raised. However, of more interest is the closing statement to this particular diary entry. Here Stewart makes a direct connection to antiquity. He simply wrote, "I should have had a Homer." Stewart's statement can be accounted for, of course, by his surroundings. We have already suggested that Stewart was very conscious that this was the region where Homer's heroes walked centuries earlier. He could also be making a more general heroic association, using Homer to emphasise the idea of glory in battle, or using Homer to recognise that this is the region where contemporary heroes now walk, in the shadow of Achilles. We must recognise too that around Stewart in the harbour at Lemnos was a flotilla of what must have seemed like 1,000 ships. Homeric echoes, in other words, abound. I, however, am not quite convinced that these inferences were what Stewart had in mind. Homer does not only write about heroic warriors. Without doubt, Stewart's desire to have a Homer was connected to geography. But what else? Homer, for the educated of this generation, defined war, both in terms of heroic glory and tragic loss. In one passage in the Iliad, Achilles even questions why he is fighting the Trojans, asking, what had they ever done to him? In Stewart's diary, his words are, at this point, reflective. And I can't help but wonder if, even at this early stage, it is not the tragic elements of Homer, that Stewart is referencing. While no one knew the horrors that were about to unfold, a recognition that death and loss were a part of the equation is perhaps an equally fitting interpretation. It is also telling that the next two references to antiquity that Stewart records, and where he uses classical allusions, are to undermine and attack the heroic ideology. The first of these building directly on what I suggest was behind Stewart's reflection. The date was the 14th of May, not even a month after lamenting his lack of a Homer or waiting on Lemnos, and only 3 weeks after landing at what is now Anzac Cove. Stewart had found himself in the Anzac contingent that had been sent to Hellas, the southern end of the Gallipoli Peninsula. His diary entries at and around the 14th of May again suggest that his mood is reflective. Stewart again has Homer on his mind. What he notes at this time is that he can see the plain of Troy. Now, standing on the peninsula, the Gallipoli Peninsula, this is difficult to do. Excuse me. You have to know exactly where to look, and even then you can't really see the plain. Troy is now away inland. This entry therefore signals several interrelated points. Two are particularly important. First, it is again evident of a reflection of how conscious he was of his surroundings and its connection to the ancient world. Second, it is perhaps also an indication that contemporary events needed to be connected to Troy through more than geography, and that Homer's poems are more than monuments to heroes making the ultimate sacrifice for one's community or nation. In other words, I think that Stewart here explicitly applies a Homeric lens to the contemporary tragedy unfolding before him. The descriptive choice Stewart makes is deliberate. The terminology undermines the war propaganda through literary allusion that makes made a direct reference to what lay before him on the plains at Hellas. To make sense of the association, the timing is significant. Stewart is writing in the aftermath of the New Zealanders' fatal charges across the daisy patch. This is an open piece of ground covered with spring daisies and a killing ground for well-fortified Turkish machine guns. Charging across this field in broad daylight cost the lives of many New Zealanders. As Stewart was well aware, Homer not only presents heroic idealism, he also writes of tragedy, a theme here symbolised by the reference to the plain of Troy. In the Iliad, the plain is a scene of combat, on many occasions a place of tragedy and loss. I believe that Stewart is utilising the imagery to comment on what had transpired at the daisy patch, or to make the link explicit. For Stewart, the daisy patch was the new plain of Troy, a new scene of human suffering. The allusion is powerful and poignant. The reality of this war is no longer hidden by appeals to imperialism, nationalism and glory cloaked in myths and names that derive from antiquity. Rather, in the same tradition as Owen, Stewart utilises a knowledge of classical authors to question what has and is transpiring. It's worthwhile to note that Stewart's method is not open criticism, but deliberate ambiguity, and the need for an individual to determine the meaning. The same process is evident in what can be best considered as his soldiers' realisation of the truth. This occurs a few weeks later, and is again expressed through a classical reference, although this time not Homer. The setting is Quinn's Post, and another failed assault. In the midst of the carnage, Stewart informs us that two of his soldiers turn to him, this is actually in the early hours of the morning, and say, "Hinc ille lacrimae," hence those tears, an anecdote from Terence, the Roman playwright. In antiquity, the lament itself had come to be used proverbially, and that these tears and lamentations are the result of a specific cause, in this case the battle that they had just experienced. The phrase is also used to demonstrate the realisation or recognition of a truth that has long been concealed. Here the soldiers reaching an understanding beyond the propaganda. The grand adventure that they set out on is revealed as a deception and labelled as such. Perhaps here too we also see a loss of innocence, the discarding of the idealistic premise that was forefront when they had left New Zealand. We must also recognise that this lament reinforces both a general awareness of classical literature and the classical lens through which this war was viewed. Like the war poetry identified earlier, this is a framework that is a double-edged sword. Heroic imagery developed on a foundation of antiquity's heroes are also undone by the literature and teachings of an ancient civilization. Again, the irony is self-evident. A classical idiom is expressed in Latin to expose the old lie. Once again, in the tradition of Owen, classical allusions are also used to undermine. They are used to attack the very fabric upon which the heroic ideology is based. Stewart's diary entry, as simple as it is, encapsulates all of these observations. We're presented with soldiers, not officers, and while their education is unknown, they demonstrably knew enough to apply the anecdote appropriately, a point emphasised by Stewart, who notes that the lament was unprompted, a comment too that reinforces both its power and its appropriateness. Its unscripted nature perhaps also signals that on other occasions there were questions and comments about the region, its history, or even about the heroes that had passed this way in earlier times. Another way in which Homer's voice may have reached the trenches at Gallipoli, albeit with the themes of tragic suffering by now outshining those of individual glory. When we move to the Western Front, Stewart's account of the war is not as expressive in terms of Homeric or even classical insights. Antiquity, though, is not completely ignored. In 1916, while based south of the River Somme, Stewart notes that he is travelling along an old Roman road. Then, while walking the ground to the north of the river with fellow officers, they come across a Roman camp, which he explores, describing it as very well preserved. While interesting, neither anecdote appears to have any further meaning, except perhaps to remind us of the ancient footsteps in which, in this case, the Canterbury Battalion were walking. What I hope I've demonstrated is that applying a classical lens to Hugh Stewart's diary provides a new perspective into our source material, the accounts of World War I, which leads to a greater understanding of what actually transpired. To close, I want to present an example that I think shows this and ties together some of the points that I've introduced. It again involves Stewart, but we're in post-war Christchurch in 1923 and in 1924, when a debate is raging around the proposed World War I memorial that Christchurch was building, the city's Bridge of Remembrance. The bridge itself was a popular choice. Its triumphal-like arch again ties us, in Western tradition, back to antiquity. In the slide you can see what I mean. Depicted, we have the Bridge of Remembrance and Titus's arch in Rome. The link is one that I hope now is not surprising. In this slide, we even have soldiers passing beneath it, as triumphant generals of old would have done in Rome. The soldiers here are making their way to King Edward Barracks on Anzac Day in 1926. These interesting anecdotes aside, the point that I actually want to raise, and where there was community disagreement, was over the wording of the Latin inscription that would adorn the bridge. The Christchurch City Council wanted "remembrance of you shall ever be cherished," to give the English translation, the official English translation. But they lost out to the Bridge Committee, who wanted the inscription that we can see on the bridge today, "Quid non pro patria." The official translation of this particular inscription is "What will a man not do for his country?" More on that in a minute. What is of interest to us is Hugh Stewart's involvement. Stewart had returned to his role as Professor of Latin at Canterbury College in Christchurch. He was also a reserve officer, of course, in the Canterbury Battalion. He was president of the Canterbury RSA and then New Zealand RSA president. With this public profile, he had also found himself on the Bridge Committee, and one can assume he was responsible for the Latin inscription that we find on the bridge today. The inscription is interesting. 4 short words that on first reading have a connection to Horace, in particular to his Odes 3 that we looked at earlier, with the expected sense of duty and responsibility coming through in the official translation. However, I believe that there is more to these four words. The Latin is not as clear as it may appear. More literal meaning, perhaps, and there is debate that can be had about this, is what is not done for the sake of the country. Here, the Patriarch could refer to New Zealand or the imperial connection to Britain. Meanwhile, what thing is not done is deliberately two-sided, honouring sacrifice while also presenting a reader the opportunity to question what occurred in a war and perhaps to question the demands of imperialism. As I've indicated, I believe Stewart was responsible for this inscription. While I do not want for a minute to suggest that Stewart was trying to lessen the sacrifice made by those who served, he clearly recognised that the feats of the New Zealanders deserved full honour and recognition. However, I cannot help but remember the Stewart sitting at Hellas, reflecting on what had transpired at the Daisy Patch. That Stewart would have found a way for future generations to ask other questions. He delivers that message through a medium that was also central to his life, a language of the classical world and a language of an empire central in the history of the Western world. Antiquity, it seems, is an important lens in framing how we remember World War I. Thank you. Anyone has any questions, I'm welcome to take them.
So you sort of had the idea that we use the language of antiquity and all the heroics of the past to sort of sweeten the truth of reality, or to...
Yeah, I think that that's part of it from the time. I mean, it's integral into it's part of the narrative at the time. So it's simply because everyone was raised with some knowledge of the classical world. So it's part of that story. But looking back on it, you can also see how it was picked up by the official correspondence and in the newspapers. I mean, I only pulled out a couple. It's just littered through the newspapers at the time. All these heroic references riding on the back of classical allusions. They come through constantly. And so I think that part of that, it does hide or, in a sense, almost sanitise the reality as you emphasise the heroic idealism using the classical world to do so. And that gives a sense of purpose to those that have lost and a way of trying to remember what their loved ones had actually achieved. So I think that's part of it. I haven't delved too deeply into that yet, but I think that's what's actually going on.
It's interesting how it was Latin that was put on the memorial arch here, rather than today, which would have more connection, because Latin has a pretty squat connection with New Zealand. Yeah.
Again, that's because it's the time.
Yeah.
And so it's 1920s New
There's
Zealand.
now the kind of debate over the lie beneath it.
That's right.
It's interesting.
So yeah, it's all shifted on and moved on. So, but at that time, there was that strong connection, and that Latin and the classical world also, it helped build those imperial bonds. It was part of those imperial bonds.
Yeah. Was it like largely because there was a classicist behind at least on board with this, that there was Latin used at all rather than English, which is like, yeah, well, like, so like the cenotaph in London says like to the glorious dead. Like most war memorials throughout Australasia are in English. Like it's actually incredibly uncommon, I would say, to have Latin on any sort of memorial, like in a village and any other. I don't know what, like, I couldn't say I've done a survey of all of them, but it's unusual actually.
No, the debate here was between two Latin inscriptions. So the City Council was putting forward its own Latin inscription that Stewart had nothing to do with, and you've got Latin inscriptions all around.
On the museum.
Inscriptions out there, Latin inscriptions in the museum, Latin inscription on the art centre entrance.
But I'm saying not on war memorials.
Yeah, you do. You get them floating around on.
I'm not saying unheard of.
Yeah,
I'm just saying
yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, it is an interesting link, and it's part of builds that connection. And it seems to be quite strong in the whole imagery that's being portrayed back at that time. So I mean, we wouldn't find it now, but at that time there seems to be that.
Well, the 9/11 memorial quotes Virgil strangely. Yeah. So.
Well, wouldn't that depend on the mores of the city fathers at the time?
Yeah, and their education and background and what that was built on is part of what's coming through. And it leads into that official narrative.
Would it be a statement of truth that the establishment in seeking to raise armies, enlist men, and to justify the aims of the war after it, tapped into that wellspring of classical education and knowledge that was so deeply embedded amongst that demographic, because subliminally almost it was encouraging them to do things in a modern context but with an ancient motivation.
I mean, that's part of it. It goes through different phases because I mean the connection to antiquity was present in the war itself. In the not in all of the, I mean most of the diaries and the like focusing on the deeds that were occurring and the horrific situation that they were all in. Occasionally they like the McPherson they reference back into it to antiquity and do that and pull that back or make that connection. And in books that are written at the time, Macefield's Gallipoli they have allusions to antiquity that they build on quite strongly. And then immediately after the war, that is picked up more by writers and by within New Zealand in particular. Well, not only New Zealand, also Australia and Great Britain. There's been a bit of work done on classical allusions, and amongst the poetry at the time and immediately after, there's a strong connection there that sort of builds and uses those allusions. It changes though. I mean, you have different groups. It's really interesting. You have different groups that use those allusions to either emphasise the heroism or to attack the establishment. And then later on again, especially in New Zealand, it's recognising the heroism officially. And then later on that switches and we sort of switch around and follow Australia more later on and become more using some of that heroic imagery to redefine ourselves away from the imperial sort of message. So it's quite an interesting and complex sort of study that's ongoing.
I was going to say, Gary, the people in La Trobe University in Melbourne doing a lot of work on this, like Chris Mackey.
Yeah.
And Tony Singer, he died now, but they were part of this project as well.
So Australia's been doing work on the Anzacs, which really is Australia focused. So they've been looking at the Australian narrative in particular, and there's been a few people in Britain that also look at the classical world within the British framework, not the New Zealand or Australia. So there's very, very little from a New Zealand perspective looking at our diaries, our newspaper reports, what was written in New Zealand, what was presented here, and that connection and tie that into antiquity, and how that may shape what was presented and then what was remembered and how we look at it.
Gary, would you say that Stewart comes closest to Homer when he is dwelling on the loss and the melancholy and the...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, his references are short. His diaries are... He writes very well, as you might expect, but his diaries are obviously focusing on what's going on and what he sees and his experiences. But he does draw on those Homeric references that are quite...
Because one of the things that you're getting, of course, in a Homer is that there is that constant focus on the carnage and the waste, and the whole thing literally ends in tears. Hector knows his goal at the end is funny, and the whole Achilles Priam thing that all talks about how it's all kind of meaningless. So it's a very kind of partial take on Homer that these people are coming out with, to an extent, isn't it? It's very slanted. It's all about, you say that the use, people might also say for the abuse or whatever, or, you know.
Especially in the newspaper reports. I mean, we get a lot of that too is influenced by, I think, Charles Bean, who was the World War I correspondent for Australia. And what he wrote was also, for the Australians, was also really influential, obviously in Australia, and been picked up by us as well. So there is an influence there too that comes through. And they draw on antiquity a lot, and you get, within the newspaper reports, as I've said, you get all sorts of quite simplistic, but just drawing on that heroic imagery and trying to make that connection. I'm not trying, make
Is his diary actually accessible to the public, or
It's,
is it private document?
You've got, no, you can access it, all right? It's in the Alexander Turnbull Library though, in Wellington, and you have to actually go and book it and go in and get a chance to read it. And there's a whole lot of diaries. I mean, his references are, as I said, there's only a few scattered through, and undoubtedly because he was a professor of Latin, that obviously influences what he's presenting. But even in some of the others, there's every diary I've read, they all go to, when they're in Egypt, they all obviously go to the pyramids, they go down to Luxor and look at the temples, they go into the Cairo Archaeological Museum, and when they've got antiquity all around them in Egypt, and then suddenly they're sailing through the Aegean towards Troy. I mean, it's going to be talked about. It's going to be part of the narrative that they're talking about on board the ships and all that as well.
Was there a similar term to go back to the past Stewart, to the past historians of other nations, of non-English speaking nations, and their memorials?
Indeed, yes, I haven't looked. So
it would just be interesting to compare.
yeah, there would be. There were a lot of different nations that Gallipoli, and we
Just
obviously
wonder how the Turks say that they're remember their side, and they must have memorials too.
oh yeah, obviously. So,
Yeah.
and how they were talking about it and painting that defensive
So
image.
it would be really interesting about it.
Well, for them,
Yeah.
their big date is March the 18th, when they stopped the forces coming through the Dardanelles, which forced the landing on Gallipoli. So that's how they commemorate quite differently. And I guess it's about, when you're commemorating things, digging into the classical past, it's often done from a very sort of specious
Yeah, it's
sort of basis, isn't it? So, so one of the guys that you were talking about, thinking about was the stuff that the people say, oh, this is Homeric, actually isn't that Homeric after all. That's what they think is in Homer. But they haven't really dipped into it that much.
And a lot of that too will be to do with the level of education, I suspect, that where classics actually fit within it. So they'll have more in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The general population, I suspect, would have more of an idea about the myths of the ancient world than perhaps most of the general population today. But their knowledge won't necessarily be that deep. They'll have an idea of what the stories are meant to be about, popular imagery, and that's what's played upon. It's not so much necessarily the actual events, except in a few snippets, like I think that Stewart is, and I think he's doing it deliberately. He does, when he refers to the plain of Troy, he can't see it. He physically can't. It's a literary illusion. So I think he's got more of an idea of what he's doing.
And Homer, of course, gives no description of the landing.
Yes.
It's not the Iliad Odyssey at all. So it's a nice thing. I mean, you can sort of go a myth pile on myth,
that's
and,
right.
and misreadings and so on, and seeing what's going on there. It's a really kind of.
And then you bring in later poetry and later movies as well, and some of the material in it just builds. There's so much.
Before you know it, people are saying Achilles and Patroclus are cousins. Kind of that.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if Stewart wrote more reflectively about his war experiences later on, whether, could the technique change or...
No, there's nothing that there is a work that was put together by, I think it was his son, looking at Stewart through his writings. But there's no, there's the book that he wrote on the First World War, on 1916 basically, part of the unofficial history or popular history of the war. And it's a good book to read. He writes very well, but there's no, within that it's more historical in the sense that this is what the New Zealanders were doing, and where they were. There isn't that classical sort of pull or push through it. It's more an account of the war.
Is it only on the theory that people like Stewart become reflective? After all, he was a very educated man.
Yeah, you wonder.
He knew the tragedy of the loss, and yet he volunteered it rather early.
I don't want to overemphasise that aspect to his character. I know that's what I've focused in on, but he was also, I think he believed he was doing the right thing, and he believed in his duty. He was part of that culture and that time as well. But he found a way, I think, to be able to reflect on it. And I just wonder, with the the inscription here, if there's a bit more to it, that's all than perhaps the official translation suggests.
And also there was about the tombs.
Yes, yeah, with his soldiers again, but that's, he made time to mention it, and it came through from his soldiers, and so that in itself is quite interesting, whether he added that, embellished it, or whether it actually occurred. But there's no hint that he embellished it. He presents us what when he says he records in his diary what he wants to record.
Yeah, do we find other, I mean, apart from the, the alleged connections to Homer, or people sort of just thinking about Homer, whether or not it's really Homeric or not, and there's Latin that you mentioned, but I just wondering if we get anything, say, from, Thucydides, looking at Pericles' funeral speech,
Yeah, a little bit.
The state, and all the great noble ideals that people are meant to be invoking. Does Thucydides come into it much?
Yeah, there's a little bit up in Auckland.
Or maybe it's not very different.
Up in Auckland in Northern World there are.
Exactly, that quote from Pericles' funeral speech, yes.
Yeah. So there's a little bit that comes through there that's a bit different, but most of it, I mean, and there is, as I indicated, this Herodotus and this Thermopylae, that comes through. So and heroic endeavour, wherever that message of heroic idealism, and then that gets played upon through the centuries and picked up again, especially sort of 18th, 19th century society, and then right the way through to early 20th century society where it's built on in the messages. So
I think there was almost an echo of this 30 years later when Paddy Lee Fumor captured a German general in Crete and was took him over the mountains for 2 or 3 days waiting for a submarine to take them off. The German general was wounded, and they were sort of sitting either at sundown or sunrise, and the German quoted a piece from Ovid, I think it was, reflecting on the time and the place and the misfortunes of war. And Furmore, because of his education, was able to translate it or to carry on the piece, which utterly surprised the German, who was of an older man and perhaps of a different class.
there are still, I haven't looked at World War II in particular, but there are the snippets that I've sort of come across as I've been focusing in on World War I. There are some interesting insights there too. So there's stories there to be sorted out and looked at as well, I think. You're right. All right. Well, thank you very much for attending.